Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Jonathan Benjamin Alvarado, and I'm the moderator for this final panel of the day, Lessons and Legacies of the Last 50 Years. Before we get into the panel, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the sponsors of the symposium. They've already been mentioned numerous times, but I feel that I must. First and foremost, Senator Chuck Hagel, thank you so very much for helping to organize this. The other sponsors include the Gallup Organization, Peter Kiewit and Sons, Union Pacific, and the University of Nebraska at Omaha. I'd also like to acknowledge Humanities Nebraska for supporting this endeavor. I'd be remiss if I didn't thank three people in particular. First, Allison Westby Roach and Joe Price, who've been instrumental in making sure that everything is operated smoothly today, and it has. So thank you both very, very much. And finally, I'd like to thank our ringleader, Dean David Booker. David assumed responsibility for ensuring that this symposium was going to be curated, and curated in a manner that would help us understand at quite depth what this has really been all about. And so my hat's off to Dean Booker. Thank you very much. So I'd like to quickly just introduce our panelists. No need for a lengthy introduction. We know them all already. But on the far left is Secretary Chuck Hagel. Next to him, the Honorable Tom Hagel. Next to him, Richard Armitage. Following General Martin Dempsey. I didn't want to call him Marty. Mr. David Martin. And finally, Senator Bob Kerrey. So this has been about the lessons and the legacies. And what we've heard today throughout all the panels are a number of the experiences, very rich experiences, very visceral, that conjure memories from the past and have helped to us to better understand the experience collectively that we all endured during the Vietnam War. And what I wanted to focus on for the final panel today were specifically the legacies that can be drawn from those lessons. And so what I want to do is give each of the panelists an opportunity to think about, reflect upon, and share with you what they believe the legacies that can be drawn from those lessons. And so I'm going to go ahead and begin at the end with Secretary Hagel.
Jonathan, thank you. And to all the individuals you mentioned, thank you. And to, of course, the University of Nebraska at Omaha and all of you who have participated and helped make this, I think, I hope, one that especially our young people can get something out of. The question, legacies, well, after 50 years, roughly, we do learn things, and we are influenced by what we learn, what we see. And I think most societies do this, but especially our society. We try to take that and those lessons learned and those experiences and then do something with those. And I think that's where you get to legacies. And like in any war, the legacies have its quite unattractive dimensions to it, like how did we get there and why did we go? And as you heard from a number of our panelists today, the lack of truth that was much the centerpiece of what got us into this war called Vietnam and why we stayed for such a long time. And the legacy of that itself, I think, has affected and shaped our country the questioning of our government, the questioning of the policies of our government. My brother Tom said something in his panel that I think really hit it. It may have been the Vietnam War, and that period was really, in modern times, the first time that an entire society began to question the legitimacy of its government and the truthfulness of the government and the policies of that government. And I think that's as much a legacy as we have gone forward now, the questioning of governments and policies of governments. And I see that as a healthy thing. I think like any dimension of legacies or lessons learned, it can go to an extreme. And you do it like in any institution or in life or in personal relationships. You do have to have trust and confidence, because that is the coin of the realm, especially in governing or in any relationship. And if that is debased, diluted, or if it disappears, that means it becomes dangerous in the sense that you then are in a situation where you don't have the ability to have functioning institutions to govern. And the questioning of our government and our policies, again, I think, is as much one of the legacies of that war as any one legacy. Second, I think too, the ability that we have now been reminded of over the last few years in particular, of being able to, as a society, to separate, as the saying goes, between separate the war and the warrior. And that, I think, will be a lasting legacy, because the men and women who were asked to go to Vietnam and serve their country, they did what their country expected them to do and asked them to do. They had nothing to do with the development of policies or say in that, but again, it goes back to the trust and confidence of the word of a government. So if you're elected leaders and your government tells you this is something clearly in the interest of your country, you must do it, you have to rely on that to a great extent. And so that legacy, I think, also comes as a result of the years that have passed since Vietnam, in being able to separate the individual who did his or her job, and did it very well, by the way, versus policies. And that's not easy to do, I know. But I think we are a far more discerning country because of that, recognizing we now have an all-volunteer service. And so it's not the same as it was during the draft days of Vietnam. So I would say that, in my opinion, that those would be two lasting legacies, and that I think are very positive legacies. The downsides, the suffering, the negative dimensions of war, and what happened in that war, I think are pretty clear, and we've certainly covered a lot of that today in lessons learned, especially from the military and our diplomacy and other dimensions that we examined in each of the panels today. Thank you.
Anybody else?
Well, you want to just go down line, or?
Why don't we just come down the line?
Okay. In fact, General Dempsey, while we're standing back in the green room, if you want to call it that, asked a question that I think is important to try to figure out how to even answer this, and that is, what's the difference, if any, between a lesson and a legacy? I don't know, he maybe just threw that off, but I started thinking about that. And a legacy, I assume, is something that carries on over time. Lesson is maybe a singular, much more limited experience that you can carry into individual situations. One of the things that I would hope was a lesson that we learned from Vietnam, but this is the one that I don't think we did. And that is to figure out way ahead of time, if we make a decision, first of all, even to go to war, to make a decision up front about why we're going and how we're going to get out and what do we call victory. For example, what's going on now, the travesty in Iraq and Afghanistan and that whole thing, when people say, well, we have to stick around until we win the war, but nobody seems to be able to define what winning means. So consequently, there maybe is no end to it. It seems we're winding it down, but make sure that we take a look at Vietnam, see what's happened, and say, well, maybe they didn't think this thing through sufficiently in terms of getting into it, but also how to get out and what we consider a victory. I can't remember if it was President Nixon or somebody else around him who said, yeah, just declare victory and leave. Is that him? Okay. Which is one way of doing it. So next time around, I hope before we do that, that we think it through. And think it through in terms of what's going to follow it. And one of the panels this morning, got me thinking about this, is that, and we see this again, where I think we failed in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that is we jumped in and did everything that I guess we said we were going to do. But when we left, look what happened. Did anybody, before they went to war, sit down and say, okay, here's our battle plan, here's the reasons we're going, whatever, but assuming we win, and of course we're Americans, so we always win, don't we, what's going to come after that? Do we have some people there that can create a stable government, even in a country that has absolutely no history of institutions, certainly democratic institutions? What's going to happen? Again, in Afghanistan and Iraq, I think we didn't learn any lessons in terms of looking that far ahead. The second thing is, and I agree with Chuck, is that I think one of the positive things we learned from Vietnam, and that is that we have, I think, as a society, made a differentiation between the war and the warrior and how they're treated. Now, having said that, what concerns me is that that's fine. Pat them on the back. They deserve all the credit they can be given, whatever. And then I get a feeling that once the welcome home is over with, then where do they go from there? The VA system, I think, has gotten a bad rap. It's got some serious problems. But frankly, I've been pretty impressed by it. But think of I think it's 22 suicides a day that are taking place of Army personnel. It's awful things, and something's wrong here in terms of how we take care of the warriors after they come back. Not just to pat them on the back and say, welcome home, thank you, and all that, but follow it through, because these people have to reintegrate themselves. So I think that's the positive outcome, I should say, of the Vietnam War. But the other is that I don't know if we've learned anything in terms of how we get in and how we get out.
If I can add one thing, just a historic footnote to your comments, Tom. There's a past to now professor by the name of Freddie Clay who wrote a book called Every War Must End, and he posited just what you talked about. Easy to get in, hard to get out on terms that are convenient to use. Every war must end. I think there are 4, perhaps 5 direct legacies. I've named one this morning already, and that is now the 2 million Vietnamese who've so entered into our DNA and, in my view, been such a positive addition to our society. That's a legacy from the Vietnam War. Number 2, the all-volunteer force, which both Senator Hagel and Chairman Dempsey mentioned this morning. That's a legacy of Vietnam, but that gives rise to the third legacy, which are fewer and fewer elected members of Congress who have military service. And this, I think, increases the gulf between our citizens and the military. And it leads to something, this may sound offensive, and I don't mean it to, but it leads to a situation which I will call faux patriotism. There are so few who have actually served that we'll let GIs go on the airplane first. I'm all for that, by the way. It's a nice gesture. But it takes the place of actually doing something for your country. And when there are fewer and fewer elected members of Congress who have a real identification with the military, then you have much less support, whether it's in VA issues or in your budget issues, Chairman. And the final legacy is one I can only mention, but I can't quite identify, because every one of you veterans, every one of you who demonstrated against the war, every one of you who went CO, every one of you who went to Canada or went to Sweden or in some way inconvenienced yourself for your beliefs, you've got a legacy. And there's not a day that goes by that all of us don't think at some point in time in that day about that legacy, and it's yours. It's not ours. It belongs to you, and you'll never forget it.
Well said. I always tell Secretary Armitage he's a lot more articulate than he looks.
We're riding back together.
I know. You know, I did ask the question about legacy, and I think you touched on it. I think it's something that starts off as a lesson, but then it's hard. It becomes kind of part of your DNA. It becomes kind of hardwired in. And one of the things that's hardwired in, and I'm speaking now as a military leader, is the continuity of our profession, you know, that runs from heroism in Iwo Jima to heroism, you know, at the Chosun, in Chosun in Korea, to heroism in the Tet Offensive, to heroism in Desert Storm, to heroism in the fight for Fallujah. And so our legacy is the realization that it's our kids that we ask to do this, you know, and it's our elected leaders who have to decide if it's important enough for them to be asked to do it. But it's our sons and daughters that we're really committing into something. And the legacy is it better be important enough, and we better be committed enough to make sure that it makes a difference, not just immediately, but over time. And then the second thing is you mentioned about the all-volunteer force, and we spend a lot of time now, the senior military leaders, with the help of men like the Secretary of Defense, in making sure that we can get some of those answers, Tom, before we make a recommendation on the use of the military instrument of power. We don't always get them, but one of the legacies of Vietnam is we always ask them.
Well, for lessons, the one that comes to mind most readily is one that we obviously did not learn. The Vietnam War began with the false belief that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin. The war in Iraq began with the false belief that Saddam Hussein was hiding weapons of mass destruction. And I blame the press for that as much as I do government. We too willingly reported every little scooplet we could get from government about the latest evidence that Saddam really did have weapons of mass destruction. And we did not, as an institution, the press, question it strongly enough. And if a few of the more powerful news organizations had raised any doubts about the intelligence, we might not have ended up in Iraq. As for legacies, I agree that the all-volunteer force is one of the major legacies. Vietnam, the perception is that it was fought by draftees, but the statistics say that it was only 25% of those who were in Vietnam were actually draftees. But every young man had to take account of Vietnam. In my class, some went to fight, some joined the reserves to get their military obligation out of the way, some joined the Peace Corps, some got married because that was still an exemption, some went to graduate school because that was still an exemption. I've often wondered how many unhappy marriages and how many unhappy lawyers there are out there as a result of Vietnam. But the all-volunteer force fundamentally changed the relationship between the American citizenry and the military. You can argue whether it's good or bad, but you can't argue that it didn't change that relationship. And from my point of view, it's what Rich said about faux patriotism. It's made it just too damn easy for the rest of us to sit on the sidelines and cheer the troops on.
Okay, well. Well, I mean, first of all, everything's already been said, but not as well as I'm about to. So, extending the concrete legacies, we also lowered the voting age to 18. The battle cry was, if you're old enough to shoot, you're old enough to vote. There were guys like me actually been in favor of raising the shooting age, but that wasn't going to happen. So, anyway, when I think of legacies, I think of really concrete things, and I take the difference between what did we learn from the First World War that we didn't do after the Second World War? Well, we helped rebuild Europe. We helped rebuild Japan. We had Bretton Woods and created the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the United Nations, and we did lots of things to make certain that we weren't going to be back in the mess, and we didn't stack arms as we did after the First World War. Those are big legacies, and frankly, I don't see a comparable legacy coming out of the Vietnam War in that area. I regard the reluctance of political leaders to support the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which isn't a trade agreement. It's much more of an agreement to get a group of nations that we want to move in our direction, by accepting our rules. That's basically what we did after the Second World War. So I do think the normalization is an enormously important legacy, and it was controversial. It was difficult. Those of us who were involved with it, I started shortly after the Berlin Wall came down in 1989. It was really difficult, the POW-MIA issue, and getting a peace agreement. Dick Solomon negotiated that in Cambodia. Getting that done was all difficult, and it was difficult for Bill Clinton to sign the normalization legislation in 1995. And we've been through the Fulbright program, building educational programs and doing lots of exchanges ever since. I mean, I think it is accurate to say in some ways it's a hell of a lot harder to make peace than it is to make war. Because war, all I need is a congressional resolution. So I thought that we had for a time a legacy. And one of the legacies initially coming out of Vietnam is we're not going to get engaged in anything. I mean, it wasn't easy to wear the uniform of the United States of America in the 1970s. And we became very isolationist for, I would say, a significant period of time. And I was hopeful that the Powell Doctrine was one of the big legacies coming out of Vietnam. Rich, you were there as a part of it. I mean, the Powell Doctrine, seems to me, is calculate what is going to be necessary to win the war, multiply it by 2, and if the American people aren't willing to support it, don't do it. And because among the problems is these wars cost money, not from beginning to end. Let's say you're smart and you got an end point and you get out after 48 months or whatever the heck. It goes on for 50 years. Mm-hmm. We've got TBI injuries. We've got PTSD. We've got men and women who are suffering for 5 decades as a consequence of these wars. And unless you come to the American people, and I thought actually that's what we had accomplished with the Powell Doctrine, but I think we obliterated it. We threw it overboard one more time. Saying to the American people, okay, if we're going to go to war, this is the real cost. This is what it's going to cost to go to war. This is going to cost us over the next 50 years. This is the price tag. And if you're not willing to pay the price, then we can't do it, it seems to me. The other thing I'd say is that we talk about the legacy of the Vietnam War. We tend to forget lots of other things were going on, particularly in the late 60s and the early 1970s. I was president of a university. I actually am not from New York. I know many of you might believe that I am. I'm originally from Nebraska, but I was president of a university. Right across the street is the house that blew up in 1970. They were making a bomb. They were going to blow up Fort Dix. There were 1,600 bombing incidents in 1970, and they weren't talking about ending the war in Vietnam. They were talking about a revolution. So when I pick up the paper and I see that people who are supporting Donald Trump are talking about a revolution if they lose this election, I think we need to remember, it seems to me, what happened during that period. That went all the way on until 1981, the Brinks robbery that resulted in two people that worked for Brinks and a police officer getting killed. And when you start to advocate domestic violence, I mean, I think we learned a lesson from that. I hope we learned a lesson from that, and I hope we don't forget that lesson. Because if you lose at the ballot box, you lose at the ballot box. You got another election coming up. And I personally am worried that people may have forgotten the lesson that we learned in the 1970s, not just about the people who opposed the Vietnam War. Most of those groups that were talking about a revolution were connected to other things besides the Vietnam War.
Let me build upon that. I'm going to go ahead and use David Rothkopf, publisher and editor of Foreign Policy magazine, in a book that he wrote a couple years back, National Insecurity. And in the book he says, the failure to understand and apply Vietnam's lessons well enough to the errors in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the War on Terror, errors that in turn are likely to lead the next generation of American leaders as much as Vietnam has influenced our recent leadership. America's hesitation to get involved decisively anywhere during the Obama administration is certainly one clear sign of that. Do you agree or disagree with that? And is this the kind of thing that we need to be, I guess, articulating for the next generation of leaders in this country? Anyone?
Well, first of all, the fact that he hasn't invaded anybody for the last 8 years doesn't mean he hasn't been involved. He used force around the planet. So I reject the proposition that he's been sitting on his ass in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, not been engaged in fighting the war on terror. He adopted President Bush's policy that basically said, if you're a terrorist and you're living someplace outside the United States, you declare war on the United States, you're not safe any longer. And he's been criticized on the left for using drones and using actions to try to reduce terrorism around the world. So it is true that he hasn't invaded anybody the last 8 years, but I don't think that's prima facie evidence that he's been an isolationist.
I don't, the way the question was asked, it makes you either come down on one side or another, pro or anti-Mr. Obama. Look, American people overwhelmingly elected Mr. Obama knowing exactly what his views were, that he wanted to get us out of what were, in his view, and by the way, my view, two unpopular wars. So I don't buy the, I'm with you, Bob, he hadn't been just sitting on his ass. However, I think that the basic point that we don't often learn from our lessons learned is a valid one, but I think we have to separate it. Military, this morning you heard from Chairman Dempsey how we learned from the problems of Vietnam, and we don't do individual replacements anymore, we do units. And we learned that from the Germans, actually, in World War II. We found from the debriefs of the Germans. This is why even when their platoons were all decimated, they were still able to fight quite well, because they had unit integrity. They didn't have FNGs, as we called them, coming in the unit.
That's a few new guys. Yeah.
So the military, I think, learns these lessons. It's the civilian leadership, the political leadership, who seems to forget them. Tom has spoken to one just a few minutes ago, but easier to get in, but figure out simultaneously how you're going to get out in conditions that are congenial. We haven't done that. We haven't done that recently. We don't generally do it. Chairman Dempsey this morning was talking about strategic controls, what the Air Force calls their bombing, and that you can't win that way. We've known that forever. We knew that in 1965 going into Vietnam. The CIA was saying you can't bomb a country which is not industrialized and expect them to submit. Political leaders don't realize the lesson that you mentioned this morning, General. That is that since cavemen were fighting, it takes a soldier or a Marine with a bayonet to bend an enemy to our will. And it takes a soldier or a Marine with a rifle to take and hold ground. This has not changed, but this is unattractive and unappealing to political leadership often. So on the one hand, the military, I think, learns lessons and always constantly strives to improve. The political leadership doesn't, because it's often inconvenient and hurts your head.
The term decisively has the implication that you're talking about committing large numbers of American troops and American military power. But I'll bet you that the current campaign in Iraq with 6,000 U.S. troops on the ground ends up being more decisive against ISIS than the campaign of 130,000 troops on the ground in Iraq was against al-Qaeda in Iraq.
I have a question from the audience. It says, our grandchildren who have graduated from college have said that they were not taught about Vietnam War. Is this just a local Nebraska omission, or is it a national policy not to teach them about the war?
Well, look, I mean, if you'd asked me when I was 18 years old to give you details that would be impressive about the war that my father fought in and my uncle was killed in, I would shock you how ignorant I was about the Second World War. And this has been 1961 or 62. So, I mean, I don't find it persuasive, I don't find it worrisome that young people are unaware of what the Vietnam War is. I mean, they will in time acquire a passion for history, or they won't, and an understanding of it. I find it more difficult when you run into adults who can name all three of the Three Stooges, but can't name a single person on the Supreme Court. But I'd support almost anything that did a better job of preparing a young person to be a good citizen. I mean, at 18, they get to vote. And I don't see an awful lot of evidence that that's become a priority for us. And I do think history is a very important part of it. I mean, because I think of all the things about the Vietnam War that bother me is how we made historical mistakes way before Gulf of Tonkin. So it seems to me that if they don't understand the Vietnam War, and it's likely that they could, as a civilian, they could be a part of, in the future, making the same kinds of mistakes that we've been talking about on stage.
You know, wars can be a case study in how our government comes to decisions that have competing priorities. That's probably the best use of it, not necessarily the study of any particular conflict. But I've been, you know, shocked, even teaching at the college level, how little, or maybe I'll reverse it, the extent to which people think there's a lot of black and white decisions out there for elected officials and military leaders to make. And as we discussed a bit this morning, it's a shared responsibility to use force. Sometimes one branch or another might actually abdicate that responsibility and leave it in the hands of another for the purposes of being able to just be critical. And secondly, when those decisions are made, there are always other people around the table who are making other demands on the system, whether it's domestic demands or demands for diplomacy or demands for other things. And it's literally, I describe it as I've watched presidents, and I've worked for three, make decisions. It's almost like when you go to the eye doctor and they put that little thing in front of your face and they say, is this better or that better? No, really, that's what it reminds me of. And so you'll have somebody say, well, you know, we really think we ought to use force in this case. And then somebody will say, well, what about if we did, what about sanctions? You know, how do they look? And then, you know, does this one make you, you know, see better, or does that one make you see better? And it's important for us all to understand the way those decisions are made, because it can lead to better decisions.
Jonathan, on your question, I think we have to recognize on the teaching of Vietnam in schools. I don't think there's any national program or conspiracy not to teach about Vietnam. But I would just make 2 points. One, it was a terribly, terribly unpopular war. World War II was about the future of the world and America. And so the context was totally different. This was a war, Vietnam, that we wanted to forget, quite frankly. So I think it's natural. You're not going to see a lot of time being used up in explaining that war in any great detail. But I would even take it further than that, and you all are the educators, and I'm not. My brother Tom is a law school professor. I have been astounded, and it gets back to a point that Bob Kerrey made, at the lack of basic understanding of our young people and our citizens of how our government works or history. I don't think we spend enough time when I was a kid on what was referred to as social studies and civics and history. I mean, if you really want to imbue legacies and lessons learned in a society with our young people, it resides in those disciplines. And if our young people come out of high school and college unable, as Bob Kerrey said, to name one Supreme Court justice, or just basically how it works. I mean, we've seen a lot of that ignorance in this campaign, but that's for probably other reasons. But a president of the United States has very, very limited powers. He's got great powers, but we have a government of 3 co-equal branches. And so there are checks on what the president can do. And so that's another part of it. Last point I'd make, but it refers back to your question about the Rothkopf quote. I think in the 8 years, and I was I was right there for 6 of those 8 years. And it spins a little back to what everyone has said, but also what Kerry noted and General Dempsey just noted. It's this. I think there has been great confusion that has been projected out of this administration on foreign policy. And when you have confusion, you have a vacuum of definition, because you can define that confusion any way you want to politically define it. Certainly the Republicans are defining it a way. Bernie Sanders defines it a way. The media interpretations define it a way, American citizens. And I'm not making the point that's right or wrong. But when there's confusion in policy, you got a problem. I don't blame that all on the president. Yes, he's commander-in-chief, he's president. He wanted the job, that's his responsibility. I also think the Republican-held Congress has a responsibility here, too. And I'm a Republican. I know some people don't think that, but I am, and still am. Whatever that means, I have no idea. That's a fleeting definition. Speaking of confusion, but nonetheless, the decisions this president has had to make or not make at this very complicated time in the world. Lessons learned, how we got into Iraq, for the reasons we got into Iraq, Afghanistan, we're in our 16th year in Afghanistan, things aren't going particularly well there. Really no questions were asked, like our panelists have talked about. What happens next? Who governs? What's the legitimacy of the government? How do you rebuild the country? 1, 2, 3, 4. We led with our military. We didn't lead with our strategic thinking and asking the tough questions before we sent our military in. So this president, lessons learned, I think, and Marty and I in particular saw it up close every day, was in fact affected by, I think, those lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, how we got in, and then how we couldn't get out. Now we're back in, now we're in more wars. But also it led to a certain confusion as to, well, what is your policy? The president brought some of that on himself. He says 5 years ago, Assad must go. Well, but our policy is we're not taking Assad on, and we won't train or equip any rebels to do anything other than fight ISIS and al-Nusra and al-Qaeda, but many of those same people were recruiting and training and vetting hate Assad worse than they hate ISIS. So you say to them in a very precise way, now we're going to train and arm you to kill these guys, but you don't dare kill these guys. And I remember Marty was sitting at a hearing with me in the House Armed Services Committee when we were asked the question explaining what our new policy was on vetting, training, arming the rebels that we were sending back into Syria. And the question was this, very simple. Well, Mr. Secretary, are you going to defend those people even though their job is not to fight Syria, but if they're attacked by Assad's forces, will you come to their rescue? I mean, they're your allies. You've trained them. You've equipped them. You've armed them. So are you saying you're not going to do that? Well, we had not made a decision. And so I said, I couldn't sit there as Secretary of Defense and say, well, I don't think so. So I said, yes, we will. Well, I just made a bit of policy there. So they weren't very happy with me. It was just one of many occasions, but in any event, that's an example, and the president got himself into that because he didn't want to go any further in attacking and going to war with Assad, but yet he said to the world, Assad's got to go, that's our policy, and so our allies said, well, what are you doing about it? I mean, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So well, this is your policy, but what are you doing? Second was the red line issue, which Marty and I were right in the middle of that. The president said if he used chemical weapons, this is it. This is the red line. And we had taken that right up through the options that we'd given the president, and then the last minute after we decided to go, the president decided to go. Hours later, he unwinds that decision. Well, you can only have a couple of those and not be put in a situation where there is going to be great confusion about what your policy is, and therefore there will be many interpretations of that policy. Rothkopf has got one interpretation, and I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but he makes some legitimate points.
Look, this thing is on, or yeah, there it goes. One of the things that helps me is to sort of try to frame this in some kind of context. So one of the most difficult things about democracy, and this is a very uncomfortable fact for me personally, but it's a fact. The most dangerous force in democracy is uninformed public opinion. Always has been, always will be. And it really isn't worthy of a round of applause, by the way. So, I mean, take some of these things. I mean, I remember as a boy seeing billboards in Nebraska, U.S. out of the UN, UN out of the U.S. The John Birch Society was a dominant political force in the state of Nebraska during that time. The IMF and the World Bank were unpopular. These were things that the Marshall Plan was unpopular. I mean, Truman couldn't get elected dog catcher in 1952 after intervening in South Korea. Nobody today would say, standing on the 38th parallel, that that wasn't an effort worthwhile. But at the time, it was wildly unpopular. So one of the great problems that you have being an American is we have responsibilities. It had been a lot easier to be born in Bangladesh or something, but because we are now the dominant power in the world. And the question is, how are you going to use that power? And I recall in '95, we couldn't get the House of Representatives to pass a resolution allowing for the use of force in Bosnia. Everybody was worried about going into Bosnia. And nobody keeps a grudge like a Serb. They're still fighting the Battle of Polce from 1243 or some darn thing. So, and it was going to be a swamp. But guess what? The only thing that stood between chaos and violence and peace was the United States military. We're the only ones that could have made it happen. And that is a very difficult burden. I mean, you watch what's going on in Aleppo. I'm not an advocate of putting boots on the ground. But there's no question the only nation on this earth that has the capacity to ending the violence is us. Now, we may say nothing when asked, what are you going to do about it? But we have to understand the consequences of that. It's not like Canada saying we're not going to do anything. It's not even like France or England. We are the only nation that can move the kind of forces that has that kind of capability. And it's a hell of a responsibility. And we are going to make mistakes. There are going to be, I happen to think 1945, that we didn't understand what it meant to let the French go back into Vietnam. They didn't just colonize Vietnam. They wouldn't let them go to college. They wouldn't let them have guns. They were worried about the Vietnamese rising up. Well, of course, they did rise up against them. And the choice at the time was, as General Dempsey is saying, it was between a terrible choice and a bad choice. You didn't have good versus bad. You didn't have something, just a bright, shining line in between. I happen to think we made a bad choice. Easy for me to say looking back on it. I was 2 years old at the time. They didn't even ask me what I thought should be done. So I do think if you look at the broad swath of history just in my lifetime, I think you do see these moments when the policymakers made a decision, in some cases an unpopular decision that turned out to be right. And I think as a consequence, in general, it's not accidental that we have ended up the strongest military, the strongest economy, and the strongest political system, notwithstanding the presidential campaign that makes me want to barf. Notwithstanding that, it is still true that we have awesome responsibilities as a consequence of our successes, not as a consequence of our failures.
Any other thoughts on that? Well, I want to kind of just follow up with that. You know, Joe Nye is pretty famous for having coined the term that, that we're bound to lead, double entendre, right? We're tied to the post of global leadership because of what the senator has just articulated, but we're also have this strong desire as Americans to lead, to be the tip of the spear in so many respects. Is that part of the reason why we end up where we do in terms of foreign policy issues?
Well, I'll lead on this one because it comes up pretty frequently. And I think it's important to recognize that after 1945, just as you were getting ready to turn 3, we made a deliberate decision as a nation that we would tie our national security in the future to a system, an exquisitely formed and carefully managed system of allies and partners. We've got, most of America wouldn't know this, but we have 53 allies and partners around the world. We're the only nation in the world that has a system of allies and partners like that. The biggest one is NATO, but that's 28 countries, or 27 count, and we're the 28th. But then there's the rest. And so we have actually made a commitment long ago that we would have an instinct for shared responsibility and common defense. Interestingly, by the way, the Russians, even in the Russian Federation and its recent aggressiveness, they're trying to restore a sphere of influence because they see their trend lines after 2020 really heading south. For the Chinese, as they reemerge on the world stage, it's all about supply chains. But none of them have allies and partners. They have trading partners and they have satellites. So the three, generally speaking, biggest military powers are all on a very different path. And to your point, we don't have a choice. I mean, I guess we do if you want to roll back something that we've been doing, for the last 70 years. But here's the other piece of that. We can't afford that. There's not a nation on the planet that could afford to do what we need to do to preserve, our standards of living and protect our values. There's not a nation on the face of the earth can do that alone at a cost that their economy can sustain.
Here's another question from the audience. Has the advancement of technology in warfighting created a blind spot where many are insulated from the human tragedy of war and all of its associated costs? To follow up on what you just stated.
Well, the advent of precision-guided weapons has certainly reduced the amount of civilian casualties. But I think most polls will show that what drives American public opinion on any military involvement is the number of American casualties. And the casualties go up, opposition to the war goes up. And we have such a technological advantage in the air today. I mean, when was the last time a pilot got shot down?
That's been a really long time. The last time American troops on the ground were bombed from the air was April 15th, 1953.
Yeah. And I remember talking to one of the pilots who was flying missions over Iraq and Syria, and he'd been there for 4 months, and he said he was out of shape because he hadn't pulled anything more than 4 Gs the whole time he'd been there, because there was nothing for him to avoid. There's a news story today that apparently a Russian plane flew across the nose of an American plane over Syria about a week or so ago. But that was, it's being portrayed as a mishap. The Russian just didn't realize the American was there. So we've given ourselves this great technological advantage, but I don't think that's what makes Americans blasé about war. I think what makes Americans blasé about war is when they're not losing their children.
Yeah, look,
We've made some comments about the technology improvements and whether or not we can evade or avoid these responsibilities. Now, I think that we need to remember something about our country. And I think this comment may surprise you. We're remarkably bloody-minded. 10,000 days in Vietnam, in a war that was daily more unpopular than the day before. We've been how long in Iraq? How long in Afghanistan? Now, thank God the casualties are in relative sense to Vietnam lower, but we're still awfully bloody-minded. We're involved in Somalia, in Yemen, in Africa, in many places. So there's another side to this, and I don't think much of it gets out in the press. Other things push it off and it gets back to the comment of whether Mr. Obama is involved or not. We're involved in a lot of places, militarily and kinetically. It just doesn't find its way into the papers. So I think as we talk about evading responsibility or accepting it, we ought to understand that, in a way, we're remarkably bloody-minded.
yeah, we're forward deployed extensive, way beyond, I think, what most Americans think, with the capacity to extend power from each of those locations. You know, there's a terrific book, but I think the larger problem that I see it is sort of framed, I think, very well by a conservative, I'm a libertarian economist by the name of Charles Murray, who wrote a book called Coming Apart, in which he's got I think a 20-question test. And his concern is, it's the elites have separated from everybody else. My father went to Harvard, I'm going to Harvard. My kids are going to Harvard, I'm going to Princeton or whatever. And they, you know, again, I've been in New York long. They say, well, where did you go to school? And they think, they're hoping that I say Choate or something. I say, I went to the University of Nebraska. Ooh, and they kind of turn away. You know? And the test that he gives is, have you ever worn the uniform? Have you ever had a job where you went home and you hurt? Have you ever lived in a neighborhood where people earn the median family income? Do you have any friends who are evangelical Christians? Are you a member of any service organization? And there are way too many people that I know today in the sort of the elites that answer each one of those no. They're sort of baffled by them. I mean, what do you mean wear a uniform? What do you mean have a friend who's an evangelical Christian? What do you mean go home? What's it mean to go home hurting from a job? I mean, and a series of questions like that. So the larger problem, I think, and it's why there's so much distrust of what the elites are recommending, is that they're separating. And not just because they're not serving in the military. They probably always have figured out to have some way to get out of the military, other than the Second World War, where there was, you know, you couldn't get out if you were, I was a pharmacist, in full disclosure, a pharmacist in '65. It's a great time to be a pharmacist. So, but I had 4 or 5 of my friends. I was recording the basal temperatures of their wives who they were trying to get pregnant, so they wouldn't have to go in the service. Turns out it's a pretty good business. I was way ahead of my time. So I'm much more worried. I'm much more worried about the separation of elite decision makers in the rest of the country.
That raises a question or an issue I've been thinking about that goes directly to that. There is this strong demarcation line, I think, between what people refer to as the elite. I don't know who all that includes, but I think we would all agree that there is such an entity out there. And one of the things that I think all these panels have convinced us of is that the process of making a decision to go to war, how to go to war, whatever, is incredibly, incredibly complex. But maybe there's a way of making sure that the burden, if you will, is spread equally, and that is, and I doubt this is constitutional, but General Dempsey said, one of the things he said recently is that you want to make sure the war is worth it. And he was talking about your sons and daughters and what have you. The people, of course, we know that it's Congress that has the power to declare war. And I think the test would be is that before specifically a senator can vote to go to war, make it understood that his kids, if he doesn't have any kids, his nephews, nieces, whatever, would be the first to go. I got a feeling we might not jump back into wars very soon.
Got another question from
Sounds
the
like the Hunger Games.
Got another question from the audience. Why has there been no discussion about the 14 months that were spent in Cambodia or the millions of bombs that were dropped in Laos?
I think there
Oh,
has. At least, I was a part of a conference in Austin, Texas, at the LBJ school, and that was a dominant point of conversation. I know a number of the people that are part of the Ken Burns 17-hour production, and it'll be, now he's going to give the full history. It's going way beyond just our 8-year involvement. So yeah, I think I think it's a very important part of the war story. I think in general there's a tendency in the Vietnam War to forget that the war was fought in Vietnam. As if the only thing that really matters is how did it affect me. It wasn't fought in Northeast Lincoln. It was fought in Vietnam. So the greater impact has been upon, and we heard this painful story about this gentleman, Rich, that who, he suffered terribly to make his way here to the United States of America. So there's a lot about the Vietnam War, and I actually think Vietnam's beginning to have their own conversation about what's going on. I think you'll see things in this Ken Burns series. I think it's a very balanced presentation, but you'll see things in there that we're not talking about at all, that Vietnam's not talking about, let alone the United States.
In a very real way, I guess the reason we're not talking about Cambodia and Laos is because this was billed as a Vietnam symposium, but we should have. We should have added it. But there's another reason, I think, and that is because what came after in Cambodia was so draconian and so horrible, with the Khmer Rouge and a quarter of the population being killed, et cetera, that people want to drive that out of their minds. And the situation in Laos involved very few Americans, a lot of CIA assets and things of that nature. So there was some bombing, certainly, by air commandos primarily. But I think the real reason is because this was billed as Vietnam, and that's where most of us served. Some of us crossed the border from time to time of necessity and under orders.
I didn't want to step in it, but I think I'm going to here. How is the current presidential election part of the legacy of Vietnam? Or is it at all? This is interactive.
Look, both candidates appear to me to be campaigning in a way that's disconnected from their platforms and disconnected from planet Earth. Other than that, I don't think it's connected to the legacy of Vietnam. It's very worrisome that it's not just Vietnam, but the war in Iraq, the war on terror. I mean, it's much more than, because it does, in a political debate, the audience oftentimes wants a binary answer. Are you for peacekeeping? Are you for sanctions. You want to send boots on the ground or sanction? That's basically the binary choice that the audience wants, and sanction sounds weak and boots on the ground sounds strong. So I don't think we're getting the kind of debate that would inform people that care about foreign policy as to which one of them is going to have the foreign policy that you're going to like.
We're not getting any debate on any issue being informed. Next question.
This was a question that was asked in a previous panel, but I think it's worth re-asking. Can we talk about the legacy of Agent Orange and the things that were learned from its use and the impact on the veterans that still suffer with some of these issues?
Well, I'll begin because as all of our Vietnam veterans have had some experience with this issue, but in 1981, I became the Deputy Administrator of the Veterans Administration under Ronald Reagan. And I actually resigned that job a year later because the Reagan administration essentially wanted to dismantle any more conversation or programs about any further funds being expended for epidemiological surveys and studies, and the question of was there consequence of exposure to Vietnam on our veterans' health care. I fought that fight on the inside the whole time I was there. Bob and I did a lot of it together in the Senate, and he did it in the Senate before I got there. But all of us have had some role in this. But today, the VA does recognize exposure to Agent Orange. I know my brother Tom, as an attorney, has been very involved in this with veterans groups in Ohio. So I think we have in many ways rectified a lot of this. The VA paying pensions and taking care of all medical needs of veterans who have health care issues as a result of exposure to Agent Orange. It took way too long, shouldn't have had to take this long. But again, I think you talk about legacies and lessons learned from Vietnam. In those days, you go back to the 70s, it was, that war was pretty, in the late 70s, we'd just come out of that war, and it was pretty raw, because as Rich Armitage noted in his session this morning, and he was one of the architects in the last days of getting as many allies out and people out in a bit of an unceremonious way in 1975 on the rooftops of the embassy. There was no appetite, political appetite in this country to be going back into any of this. And I'm sorry if you got caught up as a soldier who was exposed to Agent Orange or maybe PTSD. By the way, that wasn't recognized either. And we had thousands and thousands of bad paper, less than honorable discharges given to Vietnam veterans. And by the way, in some cases, Iraqi and Afghan war veterans. One of the things I did as Secretary of Defense, I sent a directive in 2014, and Marty was involved in this, helped me, to everybody in instructing all of our services to open up any files and review any file of a veteran who served in country at a time of war, starting with the Vietnam veterans, who were discharged in less than honorably. But it's the full fabric and complete fabric of that time, of that issue, that no one wanted to go back and look at it. And I remember at the time, and I had a bit of a problem with the current administrator, when he publicly said on Good Morning America in 2000, in 1981, that Vietnam veterans are crybabies, and that Agent Orange doesn't produce anything more than a bad complexion occasionally. I mean, he said all these publicly, and that it was hocus pocus of PTSD and so on. That was the formal position of the Reagan administration. And the Congress didn't want to touch it. Everybody wanted to walk away from it. And so the VA could only do so much if that was the policy of the administration, and the Congress didn't want to deal with it. But today, I think we're in the right spot. Doesn't mean everybody gets taken care of on any issue, but it's far different than what it was.
Yeah, and, I'm sorry. In 2014, as the chairman, I went to Vietnam, and by the way, the first chairman to go since Earl Wheeler when he was there at the end of the Vietnam War. And one of the places I went to visit intentionally was the Agent Orange, I think it was called remediation, or there was a technical term for it, in Da Nang, where they were taking vast amounts of earth and cleansing them in what looked like a monstrous generator bunker. And I point that out because we're still there, by the way, and one of the things the Vietnamese spoke with me about when I was in Vietnam was continuing that effort. And it's expensive, but it's the right thing to do. And that's the other point I want to make, second of third points. The American way of war is not to invade a country, destroy its military, pound away at the infrastructure, steal all of their artifacts, and then come home and hang them on our walls. That's not how America wages war. When America goes someplace, we typically go there because we feel we have to, but we always try to leave it in at least we try to return it to its previous condition or even make it better than we found it. That's tough. It's tough because it tends to be longer and it tends to be expensive, but I wouldn't want it to be any other way, to be honest with you. The other thing about Agent Orange, I'll say, is to me, Agent Orange is a cautionary tale about technology getting in front of ethics. Because there's a lot of things on the near horizon with technologies, artificial intelligence, performance enhancement, performance modification, robotics, not just in the air, but in every other domain, cyber. These are all things that have the ability to be weaponized. And unless we make sure that the ethical discussions keep pace with the technological developments, we could find ourselves again with things that have second and third effects we never understood.
I got an interesting perspective on Agent Orange recently. I went for a ride on the Navy's newest destroyer, which is called the USS Zumwalt. And it's named after the admiral who was the chief of naval operations from 1970 to 1974. Before he became chief of naval operations, he was the commander of the Riverine Force in Vietnam. And he ordered the spraying of Agent Orange in order to take the foliation off the riverbanks so that it would be harder to ambush the riverine boats as they were going up and down the rivers. His son was serving in the Riverine Force. His son died in his 40s of lymphoma that was almost certainly a result of his exposure to Agent Orange, and Admiral Zumwalt believed himself that it was a direct result of an order that he had given. But we were on the ship with the Zumwalt family. Admiral Zumwalt has passed away, but we were on the ship with his son and two daughters. And they all defended their father's decision to use Agent Orange, and they had statistics that would make your head spin about the number of lives Agent Orange saved by reducing the effectiveness of ambushes along those rivers compared to the number of lives Agent Orange cost by its after effects. I'm not taking sides. I'm just telling you what another perspective on that whole story is.
Go ahead. Well, it's the first time the government has done that, and typically, I'm sure, Chuck, you've heard this before, but the old expression is that when a man tells you it's not the money, it's the principle, It's the money. And with Agent Orange, it was the money. With people that were working with nuclear weapons, it was the money. For guys that were working down at World Trade Center after that attack, it was the money. And eventually, we did the right thing in all three cases.
We've got about 20 minutes, and what I'd like each of the panelists to do is to take an opportunity to give us some final statements. We've had a great opportunity here at the university today and yesterday to hear your wisdom, your insights, your reflections upon our time in Vietnam. I'm grateful for the presence of all the Vietnam veterans here today. Welcome home, which has been said earlier. But I want each of you to take a few moments to kind of, offer some final thoughts and comments about your experiences and where we can go forward from this. And I guess I want to start right here with you, Senator.
Oh, okay. I thought it was going to.
Put you right on the spot.
Well, look, if you were to ask me, I actually can still answer a different question than the one that was asked, so I'm about to do that. Yeah. If you were to ask me, what's the most important thing you learned during 10 years of being a university president? It's how generous Americans are. I mean, last year, Americans gave away $415 billion cash. And probably another $400 billion in volunteer effort. I mean, in the healthcare discussion earlier, I was saying that the Naval Hospital at Philadelphia, the taxpayers who paid for that, saved my life. But the volunteers who came into that hospital and said, it's going to be okay, also contributed enormously. And so Americans are, I mean, we're way, the second place is way down the list. We just can't help ourselves. We like to help each other. And it affects our foreign policy. And it affects our foreign policy increasingly as a consequence. I see Aleppo. I mean, I could pull it up on my cell phone. You didn't used to be able to do that. I used to, 8 years ago, I had to wait for the Secretary of State or somebody to tell me what the hell's going on in Aleppo. I don't have to anymore. And when you see it, you say, I want to do something. But the problem is, there are times when the answer ought to be, that's one thing, we're not going to be able to do it. And we're just going to have to, in some ways, live with the grief of no action. But I don't think we should ignore that we do care. That's where it begins. It begins with our own desire to try to reduce pain and suffering and to make the world a better place. It isn't baloney. We have the capacity to do it, and plenty of examples where we have.
Well, the premise of this conference is Vietnam, the war that changed America, and I think all these panels have told you all the different ways that the Vietnam War changed America's and changed personal lives. I don't think you can say that these current wars have changed America. The 9/11 attack obviously changed our airline security, but tell me what big cultural changes these two wars that we're still in have brought about. And I mean, it's hard for me to imagine a 50th anniversary conference on Iraq and Afghanistan. And if they had one, the only people who would be there would be retired military, because it's only the military that's been involved in these wars. So that's, I think, my biggest takeaway from this conference is the stark disparity between the Vietnam War and these current wars.
I was at a conference with Doris Kearns Goodwin day before yesterday, or maybe 3 days ago. And as you know, she's an unbelievably talented and brilliant historian, and she's written 5 books about 5 different presidents, and she calls them her 5 guys. And she made a comment in the panel discussion just like this, that had it not been for the Vietnam War, Lyndon Johnson would have gone down in history as one of our greatest presidents ever, because he had such a powerful domestic agenda, and he had the political instincts, connections, and acumen to deliver it. But I said to her afterwards, I said, Doris, I don't dispute that, but the fact is he had the Vietnam War and didn't handle it all that well, and it infected not just, him personally, but also the country, and then impacted on his domestic agenda. And so the point for me is, no matter who's elected here on November the 8th, their expectation should be, should be that whatever they think they're going to accomplish domestically, it's got to be done in the context of having us deployed around the world, protecting and promoting our interests, in some cases fighting, living up to those responsibilities that he inherits or she inherits because of these 53 allies and partners. And it'll be very complex because you'll have some state actors that have to be deterred, like the Russian Federation. You'll have non-state actors that stretch from Afghanistan to Nigeria that have to be defeated. And you'll have others in and around the Gulf that just simply have to be kept at bay. And so the next president is going to have multiple challenges abroad, competing priorities, and if we don't get sequestration fixed, much less money with which to manage all of those challenges. But the expectation has got to be that you can't just focus on one thing or another. The reality of life as the President of the United States is that you are equally engaged at home and abroad for the entire time you're the President.
Well, I think I might make a comment just about me, and you all can think if you want to make it about yourselves. I think the Vietnam service, at least for me, has made me both better and worse as a person. There's no one who, whatever your political views are or whatever action you took during the war or to not to participate or to protest or whatever, you're probably both better and worse off for it. For me, war is as a young, I was a young man, I was full of, I thought it was expected of me. My father was in the Second World War. This is what I did. I just knew this was what I was going to do. But in retrospect, it's too much power and way too much responsibility, too young an age, too much testosterone, and all of that. And it's just not a good thing. It's not a healthy thing. But what is healthy is that we can sit around here, and I'm proud to be part of this, and actually reflect on this, what we did right, what we did wrong, how we might avoid this, something like this in the future. And that speaks very well of us as a nation, gives me some enthusiasm, some hope at a very gnarly time because of the upcoming election. And there's one last comment I'd like to make. At one point or another in almost every panel, someone said what a messy time it is now, and usually, I guess, when we speak publicly, someone will always ask the question, has the world ever been worse? Has it ever been a worse situation? And the answer is sure, because we don't have an existential threat at this moment. We've got adversaries, and you pay your diplomats to keep them from becoming enemies, but you don't today have a threat that's going to threaten your survival. And that's a big change from all the struggle of the Cold War while we simultaneously waged the war in Vietnam. So as I said in the earlier session, don't take counsel of our fears. Let's count the plus size of our ledger. Realize that what has changed is not the world getting to be a messier place, but social media, 24/7 news cycles, all of these things. That's changed. And David spoke quite eloquently to that in his earlier panel today and what effect that's had. But we've got a lot going for us, I think, and I think sessions like this prove it.
I try to take a historical perspective of this whole thing. I start the clock running maybe in the 1950s after Dien Bien Phu with the French and what have you, all the way up to and including now. And what strikes me, and something I hope we think about, is that what we have is a history of failure of leadership. We got the president and his administration in fact, a couple presidents, into the Vietnam War based on God knows what decision-making. And then this wars, plural, that we've been in, this nonstop state of war we've been in since the Bush administration based on false evidence and God knows what decision-making. And we need to vote in people, and this is why this is so important, what is it, 12 days away from presidential election, to try to find people, leaders, not just the president, but Congress, who truly do care about America. not being Republicans, not being Democrats, but American. What's the best path for America? And of course, both sides are going to say they got the answer, but they don't. And the reason they don't is that they've proven it time and time again. They should become Americans first, and then run for office and vote for America, make decisions for America, make policy for America, and maybe we can break this endless cycle of war.
Well, again, first, thank you all, and thanks to the University of Nebraska at Omaha. This country is unique for many reasons, and I think what we heard today from all the panelists and all the sessions, and the participation from the audience with your questions, gives us some measure of who we are as a country, as a people, and it gives us some measure of the unique opportunity we have in this country to actually bring together all of these different people and spend some time reflecting on what happened 50 years ago, because it's instructive. History is very instructive. We know history doesn't stand still. Tomorrow there'll be new challenges. Every generation deals with new challenges. But I think a couple of things that are particularly unique that are relevant to what we heard today on how we handle some of these big issues, because that's what we always should be about, and that's what each leader in each institution has, and parent as its greatest responsibility, is to prepare the next generation. And we have an amazing society and culture and system that allows us to self-correct. We have 27 amendments to the United States Constitution because we didn't get it all right the first time. And we're still working on a lot of things. But we fought a civil war, got that. But since then, we've done pretty well with our differences. I mean, we have our episodes, but we have this process of self-correction. And if we're wise enough and learn enough, and what the Constitution guarantees, we are a nation of laws. We respect each other and listen to each other. We've been a little lax, I think, in that area the last maybe couple of years. But we can bring this around and come back. And I believe that new center of political gravity is forming now, and it will come. And all the big issues we're talking about today will be affected by that new center of political gravity, where we will sober up and get serious about governing in the interests of this country. Rich Armitage's point about have there been more dangerous times in our history, have we been threatened more today, or were we threatened more at other times in history? Sure. World War II was about the survival of our country, the world, democracy. But all of that said, we are, though, living, I believe, and I wasn't around for all of it, but I do read occasionally, I think we are living at truly as complicated, combustible, difficult, interconnected a time as there has ever been in the world, for all the reasons we know and we've discussed. Advent of technology, which drives so much, social change, demographics, diffusion of economic power, all the different dynamics. And our next leaders are going to have to cooperate and get the trust and confidence of our people, because they will not be able to, they have to earn it. They'll not be able to lead and deal with managing these things. And I use manage very selectively, because there are not solutions to a lot of these issues we're dealing with today, not immediate solutions. down the road there may be. But the volatility, uncertainty that we have today in the world, and I think it will get worse, represents a tremendous vulnerability to things getting a lot worse and getting out of hand. And if you look at Syria, for example, you've got some of the major powers on earth, military powers on earth, all inside Syria now with military assets, flying thousands of strikes. You got the Syrians and the Russians, the Iranians are in there, the United States is in there, the Turks are in there. Our NATO partners are flying strikes with us. Gulf countries are flying strikes with us, all buzzing around each other in this small country called Syria, plus the terrorist organizations. This is what I'm talking about when I say manage through it. And there are no easy solutions, and there are no short-term solutions, I don't think. So my point is, reflecting on what we heard today from so many people and all of you, these are times that we do need to step back and reflect and learn and listen and see what can we apply to what's ahead. Because a lot of lessons, history is full of lessons that you can apply that are relevant. Different times, different challenges, different dynamics, of course. But some of the same things don't change. I mean, they're the constant dynamics, as Marty Dempsey talked about warfare. So that would be my last point here, at least as I reflect on the sessions and the time that all of you put in to make this happen. And I want to also add my thanks to our speakers, not only up here, but in the audience and everywhere, who really spent some time preparing and I think made particularly thoughtful presentations, which I hope contribute especially to our younger people. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University of Nebraska at Omaha, this concludes today's proceedings. Thank you very much.